So we're starting at the top of page 197 of God to Man, Man to God, the Discourses of Mir Baba. And go ahead, Mayhair.
Okay. Jai Baba, Baba, please take over. First thing is called, okay. Everyone wants to know. Oh, sorry. Everyone wants to
hang
know.
on, Mayhair. Read the
Yeah, Maya's as falsehood. One,
thanks.
false values. Everyone wants to know and realize the truth, but the truth cannot be known and realized unless ignorance is known and realized as ignorance. Hence, arise the importance of understanding Maya, or the principle of ignorance. People read about Maya without understanding what it is to understand. It is now half the truth of the universe. Ignorance in all its forms has to disappear if the soul is to be established in self-knowledge. Therefore, it is necessary for man to know that which is false, to know it is as false, and also to get rid of.
Mayhair, let me interrupt to just say this sentence, to understand it is
now.
This word is probably know half the truth of the universe.
Okay, no. Half the truth of the universe. Ignorance, ignorance in all forms has to disappear if the soul is to be established in self-knowledge. Therefore, it is necessary for man to know that which is false, to know it is false, and so to get rid of it. What is essential nature of falsehood? If true is known as true, or if false is known as false, there is no falsehood, only a form of knowledge. Falsehood consists in taking the true as false or false as true. Example, in considering something to be other than what it is. So falsehood is an error in judging the nature of things. Two kinds of knowledge and valuation. There are two kinds of knowledge. One, intellectual judgments about the facts of existence, and two, judgments that imply the appreciation of the worth of importance of things. Example, valuation. Surely intellectual judgments derive importance from their being related to values in some way. Divorced from values, they have no importance. Intellectual knowledge is important when it enables values to realize, giving control over the means, or when it enters into valuation itself, modifying or in some other way affecting it. Falsehood, the creation of Maya. Just as there are two kinds of judgment, there are two kinds of falsehood. One, mistakes in taking as a fact that which is not a fact, and 2, mistakes in valuation. Mistakes in valuation can be committed in 3 ways. A, in taking as important that which is unimportant, or B, in taking as unimportant that which is important, or C, in giving to a thing an importance that is other than the importance it really has. All these falsehoods are creations of Maya. Although Maya includes all falsehoods, there are some falsehoods that count and others that do not count. If a person takes a chair to a higher than it is, it would be a falsehood, but one that possibly does not much matter. On the other hand, if a person takes the use of the chair to be important to his life, that would be a falsehood that affects his life. Mistakes in valuation, mistakes in valuation are far more effective in misguiding, perverting, and limiting life than mistakes in judgments about objects, facts. False values arise through the influence of subjective wants. Mistakes in valuation arise owing to influence of subject desires. True values are values that belong to things in their own right. They are intrinsic and are absolutely permanent, not liable to change from time to time or from person to person. But false values are derived from desires and are dependent upon subjective factors being dependent. They are relative and impermanent, liable to change from time to time and from person to person. The value of sense objects is great or small according to the intensity, urgency with which they are desired. If desires increase, the objects retain possible value. When the desires are latent and actual.
Sorry, love. Go from here, please.
Okay. If desires increase, the objects assume importance. If they subside, the object lose importance. If the desires are intermittent, the objects retain possible. They are manifesting themselves.
Oh, you missed, darling, you missed, go from here. If the desires are intermittent.
The desires are intermittent, the objects retain possible value. When the desires are latent and actual value, when they are manifesting themselves, all these are false values because they do not belong to the objects themselves. When in the light of true knowledge, all desires disappear. Objects that had importance through these desires are deprived of importance. Just as a coin that does not have currency is treated as false through it has a kind of existence. The objects of desires, when seen in their emptiness, are treated as false through those objects might continue. Desires seen in the emptiness treated as false through those objects might continue to have continue to have some kind of recognition.
Try
They
it
have
again, Meher, try it again. This word is not through, it's though.
though. Sorry, I thought so.
Yeah.
Though,
Go from up here, please. Thanks.
yeah, just as a a coin that does not have currency is treated as false, though it has a kind of existence. The objects of desires, when seen in the emptiness, are treated as false, though those objects might continue to have some kind of recognition. They are there and they may be known but no longer mean anything.
Thank you, Meher.
Welcome. I just want to ask you something before I do this thing. I don't understand the coin does not have currency is treated. I didn't understand that.
Oh, that just means if the coin is not a coin like in India, if it's not an Indian coin,
Okay.
then it's not usable. Something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
That's what yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay. Thank you, Jaipa.
Rosalie Marguerite.
When a beloved one dies, there is sorrow and sense of loss. But the sense of loss is due to attachment to the form of the loved one. It is the form which has vanished, not the self of the loved one. The self is not dead. In its true nature, it has not even passed away, for it is everywhere. But through attachment to the body, all longings, desires, emotions, thoughts were centered upon the form. And when through death the form disappears, there is emptiness. If the form as such had not come to be regarded with false importance, there would be no sorrow for one who has passed away. The feeling of loneliness, the longing that he should still be present, the tears of bereavement, and the sighs of separation are due to false valuation. They are the working of Maya. When an unimportant thing is regarded as important, we have one manifestation of the working of Maya. From the spiritual point of view, it is a form of ignorance. On the other hand, the working of Maya also expresses itself by making an important thing look unimportant. From the spiritual point of view, only God has importance, but very few persons are interested in God. If the worldly minded turn to God at all, it is visually for selfish and temporal purposes.
It's probably visually is probably usually. Don't you agree?
If the worldly minded turn to God at all, well, that's not so far off in a way. It is visually for selfish and temporal purposes. They seek the gratification of desires, hopes, and revenges through the intervention of the God of their imagination. They do not call on God as truth. They long for all things except the truth, which they regard as unimportant. This again is the blinding caused by the working of Maya. The working of Maya also expresses itself by giving to a thing an importance that is not the importance it really has. This happens when rituals, ceremonies, and other religious practices are considered as ends in themselves. They have their own value as means, as vehicles of the inner life, as a medium of expression. But as soon as they are allowed to exist in their own right, they are given an importance other than that which belongs to them. Then they bind life instead of expressing it. When the inessential is allowed to predominate, there is the third principal form of ignorance concerning valuation. This again is the working of Maya. 2. False beliefs. The soul is held in bondage chiefly by wrong values or falsehoods concerning valuation. But some falsehoods of the nature of wrong beliefs also play an important part in holding the soul in bondage. False beliefs implement false values, but they also gather strength from false values. All false beliefs are as much creations of Maya as are false values. Maya becomes irresistible in the seat of knowledge, which is the human intellect. It is thus, I got to read that again. Maya becomes irresistible in the seat of knowledge, which is the human intellect. It is thus difficult to surmount Maya because with the intellect under its sway, false beliefs and illusions are created and upheld. Barriers to the realization of the truth are the results of attempts to justify erroneous beliefs. The intellect functioning in freedom prepares the way to the truth. But under the influence of Maya, it creates obstacles to understanding. The false value of the physical body. The false beliefs by Maya are so deep-rooted and strong that they seem to be self-evident. They appear to be veritable truths and are accepted without question. For example, men believe that they are their physical bodies, and it does not occur to them that they may be other than these bodies. Identification with the physical body is assumed without proof, and they hold the belief all the more strongly because it is independent of rational proof. Man's life has been centered upon the physical body and its desires. To give up the belief that he is the physical body involves the giving up of desires pertaining to the physical body and the false values which they maintain. Therefore, the belief that he is his physical body appears to be natural. It is easy to hold and difficult to uproot. On the other hand, belief that he is something other than his physical body calls for proof. It is difficult to hold and easy to resist. The false value of the subtle body. Even when the false belief that he is the physical body is discarded, a man may still hold to the false belief that he is his subtle body. To give up this belief means the giving up of the desires pertaining to the subtle body and the false values maintained by them. So the belief that he is his subtle body becomes natural, and that he is something other than his subtle body calls for convincing proof. But when the mind is unburdened of desires and attachments pertaining to the subtle body, the false belief that he is his subtle body is given up as readily as the false belief that he is his physical body. The false value of the ego mind. But this is not the end of false beliefs. Even when the false belief that he is his subtle body is abandoned, there is the illusory belief that he is his ego mind or mental body. Man cherishes false belief because he relishes it. I have to repeat. Man cherishes false belief because he relishes it. Throughout his life as an individual soul, he has fondly clung to the false idea of his separate existence. All his thoughts, emotions, and activities have assumed and confirmed the existence of the separate I. To surrender the false belief that he is the ego mind is to surrender all that has seemed to constitute his very existence. To shed this last vestige of falsehood is the most difficult task. But this falsehood also has its ending. It comes to be shed when the soul renounces its craving for separate existence.
Thanks, Rosalie Margaret. Marvin.
The self beyond thinking and doing. When the self knows itself to be different from the physical and psychic bodies, as well as the mind, it knows itself to be infinite. As self, it merely is. With the mind, the self appears to think. With the subtle body, it appears to desire. And with the physical body, it appears to be engaged in actions. But these appearances are false. Though a man believes that he is thinking, in fact, it is the mind that is thinking. The idea that the self is thinking is due to identifying it with the mind. It is the mind that thinks, and the self is neither engaged in thinking nor in any physical actions. Of course, it is not mere mind or mere body that does the thinking or other physical actions, for mere mind and mere body do not exist. They are illusions, and only when the self falsely identifies itself with them does there arise thinking or doing. The soul, the mind, and the body, taken together, are the agent of actions and are the limited I. But the self is neither responsible for thinking nor for actions. The illusion that the self is the mind or the body, and the illusion that the self is the agent of thinking or actions, is the work of Maya, or the principle of ignorance. In the same way, the belief that the self experiences the pleasures and pains of life, or is going through the opposites of experience, is false. The self is beyond the opposites of experience, but it does not know itself as such and takes on the experiences characteristic of the opposites because of identification with the mind and the body. The self that is confused with the mind and body become the recipient of pains and pleasures. When a man thinks that he is the most miserable person in the world, he is entertaining an illusion that comes into existence through the ignorance or Maya, He is really not unhappy, but imagines it because of the confusion with the mind and the body that can have any experience of the opposites. It is the soul, the mind, and the body together that become the subject of dual experience. But the self, in its true nature, is beyond the opposites of experience. Thus, it is the mind and the body that constitute the agent of activities and the subject of dual experiences. However, they do not assume this double role in their own right, but only when they are taken along with the soul. It is the ensouled mind and body that become the agent of activities or the subject of dual experience. But the process of ensoulment is based on ignorance. The self in its true nature is eternally unqualified, unmodified, and unlimited. It appears to be qualified, modified, and limited through the ignorance or the working of Maya. 3. Transcending the falseness. Countless are the falsehoods that a Maya-ridden man endures in the stupor of ignorance. But falsehoods carry within themselves their own insufficiency. The acceptance of falsehood is always a compromise. Even in the depths of ignorance, the soul gives some kind of challenge to falsehood. And however feeble it may be in its initial stages, this is the beginning of that search for the truth, which annihilates falsehood and ignorance. In the acceptance of falsehood, there is restlessness, deep suspicion, and fear. When a man considers himself to be identical with the physical body, he does not fully reconcile himself to this belief. Man is aware of his own insecurity. He knows that something is wrong and that he has false hopes. Two types of falsehoods. False beliefs are of two types. One, those which arise from careless thinking, and two, those which arise from vitiated thinking. Falsehoods of the first type are less harmful than those of the second. Untruths of an intellectual nature arise from intellectual mistakes, but falsehoods that count spiritually arise from the vitiation of the intellect through the operation of blinding desires. The difference between these two types of falsehoods may be brought out by a physiological analogy. Some troubles of the vital organs of the body are functional, others structural. Functional diseases arise because of some irregularity in the functioning of an organ. There may be nothing seriously wrong with its structure, and it needs merely stimulation or correction. Structural diseases come into existence because of the development of some deformity, which may be grave, causing the organ to be damaged or rendered inefficient. Both types of troubles can be corrected, but it is far easier to correct functional than structural troubles. The purifying intellect. Falsehoods that arise from some fault in the use of the intellect are similar to functional troubles, while those that arise from the vitiation of the intellect are similar to structural troubles. Falsehoods of the first kind are easier to correct than falsehoods of the second kind. When false beliefs derive their vitality from deep-rooted wishes, they are nourished by false seeking. If the error in false beliefs is purely intellectual, it is easy to set it right. But the false beliefs nourished by false seeking are the citadels of Maya. They involve much more than intellectual error and are not diminished by mere counter-assertions of an intellectual kind.
Thanks, Marv. Mahu.
God as truth after transcending falsehoods. Not until the stripping off of the last vestige of Maya created falsehood is God known as the truth. I repeat this again. Not until the stripping off of the last vestige of Maya created falsehood is God known as the truth. When God is considered as divisible, it is due to Maya. There are different ego minds, different bodies, different forms, but only one self. When the one self has different ego minds and bodies, there are different individualized beings, but this does not introduce multiplicity within the self. The self remains indivisible. The one indivisible self is the origin of different ego minds, which do the thinking and doing and go through numberless experiences. But the one indivisible self remains beyond thinking and doing and beyond all experiences. Different opinions or different ways of thinking do not introduce multiplicity within the one indivisible self, for the reason that there are no opinions or any ways of thinking within the self. All the activity of thinking is within the ego mind. thinking and the knowledge that comes through thinking are both possible in the state of imperfect and incomplete knowledge, which belongs to the finite ego mind. In the self, there is neither thinking nor the knowledge that comes through thinking. The self is infinite. I'm sorry. The self is infinite thought and infinite intelligence. In this infinite thought and intelligence, there is no division of the thinker, the thinking and the conclusions of thinking, nor duality of subject and object. I read this again. The self is infinite thought and infinite intelligence. In the infinite thought and intelligence, there is no division of the thinker, the thinking, and the conclusions of thinking, nor duality of subject and object. The self does not have activity of the intellect. In the completeness and sufficiency of the infinite intelligence, there is no need for the intellect or its activities. With the shedding of the last vestige of falsehoods created by Maya, the self not only knows its reality to be different from the physical, the subtle, or the mental body, but knows itself to be God, the only reality. It knows that the mind, the subtle body, and the physical body were the creations of its own imagination. That's an infinite in intelligence. God and Maya. God is infinite by being above the opposites of duality. He is above the aspects of good and right, evil, small and great, right and wrong, virtue and vice, happiness and misery.
So he is above the aspects of good and evil.
Good and evil. Why do I have A-R-I-D? Might be a typo.
It's a typo, yeah.
Okay.
Lots of them.
Okay. All right. So I read it again. God is infinite by being above the opposites of duality. He is above the aspects of good and evil, small and great, right and wrong, virtue and vice, happiness and misery. If God were good rather than evil, or evil rather than good, or if he were small rather than great, or great rather than small, or if he were right rather than wrong, or wrong rather than right, or if he were virtuous rather than vicious, or vicious rather than virtuous, or if he were happy rather than miserable, or miserable rather than happy, he would be finite. Whatever is infinite transcends duality. It cannot, by definition, be one term among others. God cannot descend within duality. So the existence of the duality as an infinite God and a finite world is illusory. The world, a creation of Maya. How does the false world come into existence? Why does it exist? It is created by Maya, or the principle of ignorance. Maya is not illusion. It is the creator of illusion. Maya is not false, but is that which gives falsity. Maya is not unreal. It is that which makes the real appear unreal and the unreal real. Maya is not duality. It is that which causes duality. Maya is not finite. The finite is limited in space. Maya does not exist in space. Maya cannot be limited in space because space is itself the creation of Maya. Space with all that is, space with all that it contains is an illusion, depending upon Maya. Maya is in no way dependent upon space. So Maya cannot become finite through space. Nor can Maya become finite because of time. Though Maya comes to an end in the state of superconsciousness, though Maya comes to an end in the state of superconsciousness, it is not finite for that reason. Maya cannot have a beginning or end in time, because time itself is a creation of Maya. Any view that makes Maya a happening that takes place at some time and disappears after some time places Maya in time and not time in Maya. Time, as well as all the happenings in time, are the creation of Maya. Time comes into existence because of Maya and disappears when Maya disappears. God is a timeless reality, and the realization of God and the disappearance of Maya are one timeless act. Maya, God's shadow. In whatsoever manner the intellect endeavors to understand Maya, it falls short of understanding. It is as unfathomable as God. Maya is God's shadow. Where Maya is, there is God. The enigma is not cleared up until after realization, when it is seen that Maya does not exist. In the original unconscious state of reality, there is no Maya. And in the self-conscious or superconscious state of God, there is no Maya. Maya exists in God's consciousness of the phenomenal world when there is the consciousness of the physical world, or the consciousness of the subtle world, or the consciousness of the mental world. Maya exists when there is no self-consciousness, but only the consciousness of the imagined other. It is only for illusion that Maya exists as a creator of unreal and finite things. When the illusion of finite things has vanished, with it has also vanished Maya, or the creator of illusion.
Thanks very much, Mahu. Marian, please.
Self-knowledge comes to the self by looking within and by crossing Maya. In that self-knowledge, it not only knows that the different ego minds and bodies never existed, but also that the entire universe and Maya itself never existed as a separate principle. The self knows itself to be what it has always been, eternally self-realized, eternally infinite in knowledge, bliss, power, and existence, and eternally free from duality. But this self-knowledge is inaccessible to the intellect and incomprehensible except to those who have attained realization. The stages, 20, the stages of the path. All have to pass through the stage of bondage. But bondage is not a meaningless episode in the evolution of life. It is necessary to experience being caged to appreciate freedom. If, in the entire span of its life, the fish does not come out of the water even once, it has no chance of appreciating the value of water. From birth till death, it has lived only in water and is not in a position to understand what water means for its being. But taken out of water, even for a moment, it longs for water and becomes by that experience able to appreciate the importance of water. In the same way, if the life of man had been free throughout and had never known bondage, mankind would have missed the significance of freedom. The experience of spiritual bondage and the intense desire to be free are a preparation for the freedom that is to come. The path begins with conscious longing. As the fish out of water longs for water, the aspirant who has perceived the goal longs for God. In truth, the longing to return to the source is present in each being from the time it gets separated from the source by the veil of ignorance. But the longing is unconscious till the aspirant enters the path. It is possible to become accustomed to ignorance, just as one may get accustomed to darkness. But there still exists discomfort and restlessness due to the feeling that something is missing. In the stages of dense ignorance, this something is often identified with the things of the world. But when experience of the world is mature, disillusionment puts the man on the track for what is missing. From that moment, he seeks a reality deeper than the changing forms. And that moment might be described as initiation. From the moment of initiation, the longing to unite with the source from which he has been separated becomes articulate. Veil of ignorance. On the spiritual path, there are 6 stages, the 7th being the goal. Each intermediate path is an imaginative anticipation of the goal. The veil, which separates man from God, consists of false imagination, a veil that has many folds. Before entering the path, the man is shrouded in a veil of imagination, with the result that he cannot entertain the thought of being other than a separate individual. The ego consciousness crystallizes out of the working of the false imagination, and the conscious longing for union with God is the first shaking of the entire structure of the ego. The traversing of the spiritual path consists in the undoing of the results of this false working and the dropping of the several folds of the veil, which has created the sense of separateness and isolation. So far, the man had firmly clung to the idea of his separate existence and had secured it behind the formidable walls of ignorance. But now he enters into communication with reality. The more he communes with reality, the thinner becomes the veil of ignorance. And with the gradual wearing out of the ideas of separateness and egoism, there is increasing sense of the reality. The building up of aloofness or separateness is a result of concentrating upon the false personality. And the way in which to break through this self-created sense and to strengthen the new sense of unity with the reality is to say no to the false working of imagination. The act of getting rid of false imagination may be compared with the act of awakening from deep sleep. And the different stages in the process might be compared with the dreams between deep sleep and wakefulness. The process of getting rid of the working of false imagination is gradual and has 7 stages. The shedding of one fold of the veil of imagination is decidedly a movement towards the light, but does not amount to becoming one with reality, because it is but to renounce a rather more false imagination excuse me, in favor of a rather less false imagination.
Go ahead and take a sip of water or tea there, Marion.
I think this is choking me up, yes. There are degrees of falseness of the imagination according to the degrees of the sense of aloofness possessed by the ego consciousness. Each stage in the process of getting rid of false imagination is a definite wearing out of the ego or false personality. But intermediate stages on the path until the final realization of the goal consist of leaving one flight of imagination and having another. They are not the cessation of imagination. Yeah. The intermediate stages are forms of imagination. These changes of imagination do not bring about any change in the self. What changes is not the self, but the idea of the self. The gradual non-identification with the body and the identification with the universal being is comparable with the traversing of the path, though the intermediate stages on the path are all creations of imagination. At each stage, breaking through the growth of the sense of aloofness and attainment of the sense of merging with reality are both so definite that the person often has a false sense of realization. Just as one climbing a mountain comes upon a deep valley and may be so fascinated with its beauties that he forgets the goal and believes he has arrived, so the aspirant may mistake intermediate achievements for the goal. But one who is really in earnest about climbing the mountain realizes that the valley is to be crossed, and the aspirant in like manner realizes that the intermediate stage is meant to be transcended. The false sense of realization which comes at the intermediate stages is like dreaming that one has become awake from sleep without being awake. After awakening, one realizes that the former feeling was still a dream.
Thank you, Marian. Anne Elizabeth.
Planes and states. Each stage of advancement is a state of consciousness. An advancement from one state of consciousness to another proceeds with the crossing of the inner planes. Thus, there are 6 intermediate planes and states of consciousness to be experienced before reaching the 7th plane, which is the end of the journey where there is realization of the God state. The nature of samadhi, istigrak. After entering a new place of consciousness, a person usually takes some time to function on that plane. As there is a radical change in the conditions of mental life, he may experience a sort of paralysis of mental activity, which is known as samadhi. When the aspirant enters upon a new plane, he merges into the conditions of that plane before he can experience what is characteristic of it. Just as a pilgrim who is tired by the journey goes to sleep, consciousness, which has made the effort of ascending to a new plane, goes through a period of lowered mental activity comparable to sleep. But the samadhi is fundamentally different from sleep, because in sleep, a person is unconscious, whereas in samadhi, he is conscious of bliss or light or power, though unconscious of his body or its surroundings. After a period of comparative stillness, the mind begins to function on the new plane and experiences a state of consciousness utterly different from that which has been left behind. The first 3 phanas. When the aspirant enters a new plane, along with the lowering of mental activity, he experiences a substantial diminution in ego life. This curtailment of the ego life is different from the final annihilation of the ego, which takes place at the 7th plane. But these different stages of the curtailment of the ego at the intermediate 6 planes deserve special attention. In the Sufi spiritual tradition, the final annihilation of the ego is described as fana filah, and the earlier samadhis of the 6 planes of duality have been recognized as kinds of fana, since they also involve a partial annihilation of the ego. Each of these fanas of ascending order has its own characteristics. When the aspirant arrives at the 1st plane, he experiences his first merging of fana, which consists in the minor annihilation of the ego. He is temporarily lost to his limited individuality and experiences bliss. Many aspirants think they have realized God and get stuck in the first plane. But if the aspirant keeps himself free from self-delusion, or comes to realize that his attainment is transitional, he advances and arrives at the second plane. The merging into the second plane is called Annihilation, or the annihilation of the false. The aspirant is now absorbed in bliss and infinite light. Some think that they have attained the goal and get stranded in the second plane. But others who keep themselves free from the self-delusion enter into the third plane. The merging into the third plane is called the Annihilation, or the annihilation of the apparent. Here the pilgrim loses for days all consciousness of the body and the world and experiences infinite power. But since he has no consciousness of the world, he has no occasion for the expression of his power. This is the Vidha Samadhi, or the state of divine coma. Consciousness is now completely withdrawn from the world. The dangers of the fourth plane. If the aspirant advances further, he arrives at the fourth plane. The merging into the fourth plane is called Malakuti, or the annihilation leading towards freedom. The aspirant now experiences a particular state of consciousness. The aspirant now experiences a peculiar state of consciousness, since he not only feels infinite power, but also has occasions for its expression. He can know everything. He can know what anyone in any part of the globe is thinking or doing. Further, he has not only occasions for the use of his powers, but has an inclination to express them. If he falls prey to this temptation, he goes on expressing powers and gets caught in the alluring possibilities of the fourth plane. The fourth plane is for this reason difficult and dangerous. The aspirant is never spiritually safe and has always the possibility of a reversion until he has crossed the fourth and arrived at the fifth plane. The phanas of the fifth and the sixth plane. The merging into the fifth plane is called Chabaruti, or the annihilation of all desires. Here, the incessant activity of the intellect comes to a standstill. The aspirant does not think in the ordinary way, and yet is indirectly a source of thoughts in others. He sees, but not with the physical eye. Mind speaks with mind, and there is neither worry nor doubt. He is now spiritually safe and beyond the possibility of downfall. And yet many who reach this exalted plane find it difficult to resist the delusion that they have attained godhood. In his self-delusion, the aspirant says, "I am God," and believes himself to have arrived at the end of the spiritual path. but he perceives his mistake as he advances to the sixth plane. The merging into the sixth plane is called Fana-i Mahabubi, or the annihilation of the self in the beloved. Now the aspirant sees God directly and clearly, as an ordinary person sees the different things of this world. And this perception and enjoyment of God suffers no break. Yet, he does not become one with God. The state of conscious Godhood. When the aspirant ascends to the seventh plane, he experiences the last merging, which is called Vanafila, or the final annihilation of the ego in God. Through this merging, the aspirant loses his separate existence and becomes permanently united with God. He is now one with God and experiences himself as none other than God himself. This seventh plane, Vanafila, is the terminus of the spiritual path, the goal of all search and endeavor. It is the Sahaj Samadhi, or the Nirvikalp Samadhi, characteristic of conscious Godhood. It is the real awakening. The aspirant has now reached the other shore of the vast ocean of imagination and realizes that this last truth is the only truth, and that all other stages on the path are illusory. He has arrived at the destination.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That looks like the end of that discourse.
Well,
So-
hooray. That's all I've got to say.
Page
Hooray.
212 for next time.
If we have time at the end, I wrote a poem that's really about
Should we do stop